Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage George R.R. Martin and Stephen King.
Thank you. It's all downhill. It's all downhill from here.
My, there are a lot of them.
Yeah.
Well, good to see you all. And Steve, welcome to the land of enchantment.
Thank you.
Have you been here before? Do you know New Mexico?
Yeah, I've been to New Mexico before, but probably I wasn't entirely straight at the time, and this time I am, so there's a big difference. Yeah, I've been to Taos, so listen, you know, this guy's a native son, and he's terrific, okay? And before we do anything else, I have to tell you that that I had not read any of the Game of Thrones books. This goes back about, I'm going to say about 6 years, and I had kind of a thing where I said to myself, you know, probably don't want to read these things because, you know, I tried to read Robert Jordan and I couldn't read any of those books, and so I thought probably these are just terrible. So, you know, I didn't have any real urge to go into them. My wife had them all, but my wife and I don't talk that much about books. We talk about everything else. So here's what happened. I was down in Florida. I don't want to go there, but we turned 65 and it's the law. So we're down in Florida, and I drove down, and we were having dinner with some friends when we were down there, and I started to have what I thought was a cramp underneath the left knee. And by the time that we got back to our house, I could barely walk, and I just had to kind of pull myself up the stairs. And pretty soon it was all down my leg and up to my hip and everything, which scared the shit out of me because I'd had an accident before where some guy hit me with a van, and that was on the right side, and this leg is not as strong. So I went to the doctor, and the doctor said, well, you're getting on in years, you have sciatica. And I said, how long is this going to last? And he said, it will go away when it goes away. And sciatica is this weird thing. Usually if you have a back problem, it's in your back. But this was in the leg, and somehow it's worse when you lie down. So I couldn't really sleep, and I had a book that I was supposed to record. We were in the Sarasota area, and I had to go to Bradenton, and it hurt to drive. Everything hurt, and I couldn't sleep. So one night while I'm awake, I'm saying to myself, well, I'll try one of these fucking George Martin books and see if this thing is any good. And it just carried me away. It just carried me away. The books, which are what books are supposed to do, and what I had not expected, the last thing I had expected from those books is what page turners they are, you know, and I just got lost. And so when I couldn't sleep at night, I read the books, and then when I had to go and record this thing, I had the audio versions, and I'd plug in the CDs in the car, and they saved my life, man, so thank you.
Well, I'm glad, because you've written many terrific books since. I would have been ashamed not to do that. Steve and I actually knew each other back in the old days, by which I mean like the 70s and the early 80s. In those days, he used to go to science fiction and fantasy conventions, where you know, we would run into each other at the World Fantasy Convention.
We played poker together.
We played poker together in a St. Louis convention, Archon. Nickel, dime, quarter. And I learned then a valuable lesson. You cannot bluff Steve out of a pot, even if you raise a whole quarter. He just called all my bluffs. But well, welcome back to New Mexico.
It's great to be here. Great
And
to be here,
you're
yeah.
here with the concluding book of the Mr. Mercedes trilogy.
Right.
Which,
And you know, I got to say that I'm doing this with George now, and like last month, George did a conversation like this with my kid, Joe Hill. His name is actually Joseph Hillstrom King, but he didn't want to be. He didn't want to feel that he had made a success or whatever on my coattails, so he wrote under this pen name. And he's got a book that is currently on the New York Times bestseller list. It's called The Fireman. It's terrific.
yeah, it's amazing. An amazing book. An amazing book. And at the Jean Cocteau Cinema in Santa Fe, we still have signed copies.
Yeah.
So drive up to Santa Fe and get an autographed Joe Hill.
That's right, and it's terrific, and you should buy it, but you should buy my books first because I'm older, and I'll die sooner, so there. What do you want to talk about, George?
Joe was a great interview. Actually, I'll start with an embarrassing story that Joe told me. So when your name somehow came up in conversation with Joe, I think it was before he made us all play kazoos. We're not going to make you play kazoos, by the way. So you can. I guess we've disappointed them. We should break out the kazoos. Yeah. And
I got a kazoo story I got to tell. But
Joe said that you and your wife were old hippies. And when he was growing up, every once in a while, you would cheerfully announce, "Tomorrow is Naked Day." And then
Yes.
he and his siblings would have to cover their eyes as you and Tabitha walked around the house all day naked.
Yes, I've heard that story from Joe many times. It's not true. And that story tells more about my son's ability to fantasize than anything else. No, it isn't true. I got to tell a kazoo story. Joe handed out kazoos because he wanted to get people involved and do a sing-along or something like that. And I said, well, maybe you can get him to play kazoos because almost everybody can play kazoos. Now, I used to play guitar with a group called the Rock Bottom Remainders. It was a bunch of,
All right.
there was a bunch of writers, and we also had one part of this group that was called the Critics Chorus. They were rock and roll critics, and they were very literate. And the thing that I found out about critics, and I think that we sort of intuit this, is that rock critics can't play music and they can't sing. They really can't do anything. And we had one guy, Joel Selvin, who was a critic for the San Francisco Chronicle, and we did a song by the Trogs, Wild Thing. And it was the perfect song for the Remainders because it has 3 chords, E, A, and D, and you know, it just sort of repeats. But in the middle of the song, the pop song, there was a kind of a sweet potato or ocarina solo, kind of a tootling little thing. And Joel Selvin really wondered what was going to happen with that. He was very worried about it. Finally, I said, Joel, why don't you do it? You do it on a kazoo. You just play the kazoo. Anybody can play that. And when the time came, Joel got so fucking excited that nothing came out. He blew so hard that it just wheezed. And but it was like Foghorn Leghorn in the comics. You could see the red going up his head. And it made me feel good because he was, after all, the enemy.
I mean, as long as we're talking about Joe, you know, both Joe and your other son Owen are themselves writers, so you have a whole family tradition here. Is that something that you wanted them to do, or was it the reverse, where you say, sons, whatever you do, don't become a writer?
No,
I mean,
but
do you yourself, was your father someone who encouraged you to be a writer, or your parents, were they readers? Was this something, a family tradition?
Well, I don't know. I think that there is a genetic, component to this, and it isn't just the boys. My wife has published 5, 6 novels, and including. I'll tell her you said that. Including one called Small World, which is kind of like a little bit like the Richard Matheson book, The Shrinking Man. So they get it from both sides, and my father was a writer who submitted a lot of stories to the pulp magazines like Argosy and Blue Book, but none of them ever got published. So, no, I mean, Tabby and I, the thing is, like, our kids grew up in a house where there were books everywhere, you know, and there was TV, movies. We never really, you know, censored their TV watching or said you can watch for an hour and then you have to do your studies or whatever. I think that the best way to teach kids isn't by laying down a lot of rules and that shit, but giving them an example and just, you know, and so the books were there. And the thing is, too, you know, going back to Joe again a little bit, was I think creativity is a mystery. We talked about this a little bit. And I think that you have a package inside you that at some point it's like live material and it starts to stir. You know, you get close to something. And for my son Joe, they used to drive us crazy. My wife called when Joe was 4 and our daughter Naomi was 6. My wife used to call the hours between 4 and 7 o'clock when they went to bed the hours God never should have made. Because they just fought constantly, and they fight over the TV or they fight over anything. And one day, just out of total desperation, I stopped at the drugstore and I got a G.I. Joe comic book. And I took him on my lap, and that was the end, man. That was the end of the fighting. That was the end of everything, because Joe just fell into that comic book world. And now he's got a comic series that he's written for years called Lock and Key. And he's been successful at that, too, so.
It's interesting that your father was a writer who was trying to sell to the pulps, but failed at it, and yet, did he encourage you to write even though he had failed at it? You know, my father was a longshoreman, and he certainly didn't. In fact, he said just the opposite. Son, you don't want to wind up on the docks unloading a ship. Do something else, yeah. But don't be a longshoreman.
No, my father didn't encourage me to do anything because he split when I was 2. My brother David was 4. He said he was going out for cigarettes, and it must have been a rare brand because he's still looking, so far as I know. But yeah, so my mother raised us, and she was a reader herself, and she read to us, and she read comic books when we brought them home. She didn't like it, but she would. And I remember very vividly when I was about 7 years old, sitting out on the porch in this apartment where we lived in Stratford, Connecticut, and she read us Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I kind of, you know, that was another thing that sort of tripped my dials. But around that same time, we were living in apartments in Connecticut, and my mother was working. She worked in a laundry for a while, and she worked in a bakery for a while, and she was a housekeeper for a while. And we didn't have much because our dad left her with a lot of bills when he ran out. But my brother came running into the room one time. We were latchkey kids before there were latchkey kids. So we got home from school. My mother was working. We had the apartment to ourselves. And David said, "You got to come up to the attic. I found a whole bunch of our dad's stuff that our mother had, you know, stowed there." So we went up, and there were boxes and boxes of stuff. He was in the Merchant Marine, and there was stuff from overseas, and there were little, you know, Japanese dolls, and there were drink coasters from foreign places, ports of call, as they used to say. And there was a box of books, and they were paperbacks, and the one on the top was The Thing from the Tomb by H.P. Lovecraft. And when I saw that, I said, "That's really scary. This is what I want to do." So.
Well, I think you've done it.
How did it happen for you? When did you start to do it? Why? Why, George? Why? Tell us why.
I started writing stories really young. I mean, and since I'm a pack rat, I still have most of them. I mean, I have one of those speckly black and white school notebooks filled with an encyclopedia of space, where I would draw a planet and then I would write, block printing, because I hadn't learned to write yet, so I must have been like 5 or 6 years old, the characteristics of this planet. And, the planets were like circles colored in with crayons. Mars was red and Venus was green and all that. But I had mixed up Mars and Venus with like Mongo and planets that I entirely invented, that I was making up my own planets to add to the solar system.
These people don't remember Mongo.
They don't remember Mongo? Ming, the emperor.
Ming the Merciless.
Flash Gordon.
Flash Gordon.
Not to be confused with
Dr.
Flesh
Zarkov.
Gordon, an entirely different movie. And then I remember I used to buy these little aliens that they sold at the 5 and Dime store for 15 cents each, little plastic aliens, and I got the whole set of them and played with them and invented personalities for all of them. I decided they were a gang of space pirates, and the one with the big head was the chief, and the one who was holding a weird weapon was the torturer. I had to have a torturer
basically you're
right
saying
from the first.
you were crazy.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
I think it was partly, I mean, we didn't have much money. I lived in Bayonne, New Jersey in the federal housing projects. My father went through long periods of unemployment before he finally got on as a longshoreman. We had no car. We lived on First Street. My school was on Fifth Street. That was my world. It was 5 blocks long. So books and comic books, which I also read vociferously, were my ticket to a wider world. I dreamed of, what the hell was on 8th Street? I had no idea, a whole different world with alien peoples. And on First Street, of course, Bayonne is a peninsula, so there's a deepwater channel called the Kiva that separates Bayonne from Staten Island, New York. So I would see the lights of Staten Island from our windows in the dark, and that was, Shangri-La to me. And I invented all these stories to kind of explore the world.
Yeah, I think that the same thing is true for me. I just started to fantasize at some point, and then I began to put the fantasies down on paper. And this is a wonderful job, but it's a strange job in that the stuff that I've written, there's one story called Survivor Type about a doctor who is muling heroin into the United States, and his ship sinks, and he is the only survivor, and he winds up on this rocky island where there's really nothing. And there are a couple of birds, and there's some water that gathers in cracks in the rocks, but he catches one of the gulls and eats it raw. And while he's chasing another one, he snaps his ankle, and after that he can't catch the birds anymore. But he does have all this heroin, and he is a doctor. And at that time I was living in a little town in Maine, and we had a retired doctor who lived next door. So I went over to him and I said, Dr. Drews, how long could a man survive by cutting off pieces of himself and eating them? And he gave me this look like, well, like I was fucking crazy. But I persisted, and finally he said it would depend. First of all, he would die if he didn't have anesthetic. And I said, well, he's got anesthetic. He's got plenty of anesthetic. And then I said, but what would be the biggest problem? And he said, the biggest problem in a case of cutting pieces of yourself off, you see, I got this idea because miners in cave-ins, when they run out of water, will drink their own urine. And so he said it would depend on how long the patient could withstand the repeated shocks to his system. And he said he would really have to be a survivor type to do that. I thought, well, there's the name of my story right there, Survivor Type. And all I'm trying to say here is you just have these sick ideas. George has written his share, believe me. And instead of going to a shrink and paying the shrink, we write them and you pay us. It's a pretty good deal.
Right. I mean, did you always dream of being a writer? What was your first story sale, and how long did you have to submit stories and get rejections before you broke through?
Yeah, I wanted to be a writer. That was, for me, you know, that was the thing that I really cared about because I really liked to do it. From an early age, I was getting something back. You always know, like, when a kid finds his sweet spot because you don't have to tell him to practice. It isn't practice, you know, you're getting something out of it. So I started to write stories and submit them around the age of probably 12, my first submissions. And, you know, I submitted them to Forrest J. Ackerman.
Oh, boy.
Who had Famous Monsters of Filmland, and he had other magazines. There was a magazine called Spacemen, I think. And I got to see Forey before he died, and he had saved some of those early submissions. So, and they're written on a, you know, old Royal typewriter that I had. So I started to send stories out, and I pounded a nail into the wall of my bedroom. And when I got the rejection slips back, I would put them on that nail. And by the time that I was 16 or 17 years old, the nail tore free from the plaster, so I just got a bigger nail. And then when I was 19, I sold a story to Startling Mystery Stories. It was called The Glass Floor, and they paid me, like, I think, $35. That was my first sale.
It's a lot of money back then.
It was a lot of money. It meant a lot. But the thing is, like, can I tell another story?
Sure.
I sold 2 stories to those Robert Lowndes magazines, Startling Mystery Stories.
Right. I remember them.
There was another one, Tales of Horror and Suspense or something. They were small checks. So when I was a senior in high school, in college rather, I wrote for the campus newspaper, and one of the big attractions was they had all these typewriters, and my typewriter in the apartment where I lived basically sucked a bird. So they had these typewriters, and just before I graduated, I had an idea. I'd worked the summer before in a woolen mill, and when 4th of July week came along, the foreman said, we're going to shut down the mill for a week. Now you have your choice. Either you can take the week off without pay, or you can join this cleaning crew. We're going to go down and we're going to clean the basement and the sub-basement where nobody's bothered to clean anything out for years. So I took the week off, and when I came back, this guy I worked with in the dye house said, oh man, Steve, you should have been there. It was far out. They gave us hoses, and we went down there, and there were rats everywhere, man. They were jumping out. They were as big as cats, and we washed them down the gullies and, you know, into the Androscoggin River. So I was thinking about this, and I said, I'm going to write a story, but in my story, there's going to be even bigger rats, and they will have mutated down there in the dark. They're going to be as big as cats. They're going to be as big as dogs. And so that story was called Graveyard Shift, because that's when they were doing it. And so I was working on this story, and one of my friends came in, Mac came in, and he said, what are you doing, Steve? And I said, well, I'm writing a story about giant rats under a mill, and this cleaning crew is kind of besieged by these rats and driven backward. He said, man, that's great. He said, what you got to do is, like, one of these guys goes crazy and he's running around and he's ripping rats' heads off, you know, and flinging the bodies beside and everything. And I thought to myself, it's good, but it's not literary, okay? It doesn't have that sort of, like, feeling, that kind of, like, John Cheever, John Updike kind of feeling. So what I did instead of that was, because he was on the right track, he wasn't shooting high enough. So in my story, one of the guys is bitten by rats all over his legs, and he screams, and while his mouth is open to scream, a rat climbs into his mouth. And I just wanted to try and, do it as elegantly as possible. So you can feel the rat's fur on the roof of his mouth and the legs scrabbling at his chin and his throat as the rat grabs hold of the guy's tongue and rips it out of his mouth. And I sold that story for $200. Okay?
Which is more than 35.
Pardon me?
Is more than 35.
It was more than 35.
You were moving up in the world.
That was to Cavalier magazine, and I sold a bunch of others to those. I got married the next year, and we had a little girl, Naomi, and when she got the ear infections, my wife would say, "Hurry up, think of a monster."
Oddly enough, rats helped launch my own writing as well.
They've been good to us. Rats have been good to Steve and George.
Yes. I think I was a sophomore in high school, and I was kind of a nerdy kid. I wasn't one of the cool kids. I wasn't good at sports. I was good at, honor roll and stuff, but that doesn't cut any slack in school. That just gets you more abuse. But sophomore year, one of my English teachers was teaching Poe's Pit and the Pendulum. And he said, this story has a terrible ending. If you remember that story, the guy's in the pit, the pendulum's coming lower and lower, and then suddenly in the last paragraph, trumpets sound, and the pendulum pulls up, and he's saved. The Inquisition is in the hands of its enemies, is the last thing. And my English teacher said, this is a classic example of the Deus ex machina. So our assignment was to write a better ending for the pit and the pendulum.
Oh, boy.
So I wrote an ending where the rats came out and ate the guy, and they ate his cheeks, and they ate his toes, and they ate his face, and the pendulum cut him in half, and he died horribly, screaming in horrible pain. I thought it was a much better ending than the one that Edgar Allan Poe came up with.
It has a certain uplift to it, I feel.
It does. But what was the real boost for me is the teacher liked it too, and he had me read it to the class, and suddenly all these kids who'd never thought much of me thought I was the coolest kid in class, man. Wow, what a great story. The rats ate the guy. They loved it. And I said, well, I got to do more of this writing stuff. It's really, it's really pays off.
Yeah. That's pretty much my experience with it too. And one of the things it's funny is, we do this, we talk about these things, and you guys all laugh and applaud, but later on, when you get home and you're in the dark, it's not going to seem so funny then.
I've always taken to heart some of the stuff you wrote in your first book about writing, Danse Macabre, which I was totally engrossed by. I thought it was an amazing book.
Terrific, thanks.
And you talked about how you strove to create terror in your stories. But when you couldn't create terror, which is very hard to create, you settled for horror. Mm-hmm. And when you couldn't create horror, you settled for gross out.
Right. What I said was, I'm not proud. And,
I took that to heart and adopted that kind of philosophy myself. And I can still see all that going on in your books. I think the rats in the mouth are probably the gross out, would you say?
Yeah, I would say that's the gross out. And probably the survivor type story is a gross out too. But there are other things where I think it sort of depends on the story and what you want to put across in there. I did a book called Full Dark, No Stars. Thank you. Those are nasty stories in there, and one of the stories is called A Good Marriage, and I got sort of fascinated by Dennis Rader, who is called BTK, Bind, Torture, and Kill. And he had killed 8 or 9 women over a period of years. And when he was finally caught, his wife didn't know. She didn't know that she was married to this monster, this psychosexual homicidal maniac. And a lot of people didn't believe her, but I did, and I wanted to write a story about a woman who finds out that she's married to a man who's a monster. And that was like what I would call terror, her situation there. So it varies from story to story. But I don't necessarily think that the gross out is a bad thing.
No,
No.
it's
I'm
fun
trying-
in odd ways. The rats have done very well for both of us.
Yeah, I would say so. There are plenty of gross out moments in your books, George.
Well, there are, yes.
Yeah.
Although I've never done shit weasels as you did in Dreamcatcher.
Yes, shit weasel's not one of my finest accomplishments. I think actually, you know, to my mind, the finest gross out movie moment was in a movie that I wrote called Creepshow, and E.G. Marshall was in the movie, and he played a guy. There was the last story in the Creepshow thing was called "They're Creeping Up on You," and this was a guy who was deadly afraid of bugs. And at the end of the movie, he sort of exploded, and there were thousands of cockroaches that came out of him. And Tom Savini did the special effects for that movie, and I had also, well, I'm not exactly unproud or humiliated. I played a character called Jordy Verrill in that movie. And to this day, fans come up to me and say meteor shit. Which I just did. So, but at the end of the Jordy Verrill story, Jordy, who is growing and becoming a weed at that point, blows his head off, what remains of his head, with a shotgun. And so I had to have a full head mold made of my head. And it's a very uncomfortable experience. They give you a straw that you can breathe through, and you have to sit there for about a half an hour while it hardens. So you think about like a CAT scan or an MRI, only spread all over your head. And it was a creepy experience. So E.G. Marshall comes in because he had to have one done too. And I thought to myself, I'm going to watch this because this guy's going to freak out when he gets this plaster all over his head with just the straw. But he was just as cool as a cucumber about it. And the thing is over his head, and he's got the straw out of his mouth. And we're in the makeup room, the special effects area, and E.G. Marshall raises his hand, and he goes like that. So Tom knew what he wanted, and he got a pad of paper, and he put a pencil in E.G. Marshall's hand, and he's all covered with plaster down to the neck, and I'm watching as he writes, B-O-U-R-B-A-B-O-N, bourbon. So they got some bourbon and they got an eyedropper and they put it down that straw. And he was just as happy as a pig in shit, so.
I have avoided that experience so far. But at one point during first season of Game of Thrones, I was hoping to be a severed head. You know, there was the scene where Ned was killed and his head was on the wall, and Sansa was made to look at all the heads on the wall.
It was quite a moment, I'll tell you that.
And I suggested to David Benioff and Dan Weiss that the three of us be the heads next to Ned, and they were all cool for the idea. So we were all going to have our severed heads made and mounted on the wall. But then, you know, we were, like many television shows, facing budgetary problems, and they found out what those severed heads cost. So they said, sorry, George, we can't afford to make up these special severed heads for just a shot. Instead, you know, they recycle a lot of things in Hollywood. Instead, they bought a big box of used severed heads from a previous production, and we put all those severed heads next to the wall. And they were cheap. We got the box. I don't know what they came from, the severed heads that we got in the box. But they were cheap, and they saved us money, and everything worked well, except one of the severed heads was George W. Bush. And, and that was fine too, because he was bald and nobody mentioned him until like a year later when they're doing the Blu-ray version. And one of the directors doing the commentary said, "Oh, and you see the head next to Ned? That's George W. Bush." And of course, the right-wing talk radio got a hold of it, and it went crazy. Rush Limbaugh was having kittens, and people were claiming we wanted to assassinate the ex-president, and we were Hollywood liberals who had mounted head. And I'm trying to say, no, it was just we just bought a big box of heads. It could have been anybody's heads in there.
You know what? I'll tell you what. That's what you get into when you do what we do. I mean, it's a wonderful thing, but it's really strange. We did a mini-series of The Stand, and we filmed a lot of it out here in the West. Thanks. Thank you. And we filmed a lot of it on location in Boulder, Colorado, because a lot of it's set in Boulder. And we did this one scene where Harold Lauder and he's on this burial crew, and they go into a church where the people have gone when they are sick before they expire, and the church is full of dead people. So we needed to fill a church with dead people, and the director, Mick Garris, had a call in to some special effects people that he knew that had worked with a couple of other directors who'd done zombie pictures. So the people in Boulder were treated to the sight of 2 pickup trucks full of dead bodies. They were coming to this church on the west side of Boulder, and they were all spongy, because that's basically what they are, and they're all kind of bouncing up and down, and it was very realistic. They really looked like, dead bodies, which they're supposed to look like, because it's...
So let's talk about something
Moving
a little
right
more
along.
serious for a moment here. Let's talk about a little bit about End of Watch and the Mercedes thing here. Your villain, and you guys haven't read it yet, but it's terrific. I think you'll like. I hope you've read the first 2. If you just picked up this book here, you have 2 more to read before it. That you have to read them in the right order, because it's a trilogy, starting with Mr. Mercedes.
There you go. Buy them all and give them to your friends.
And Mr. Mercedes begins with Brady Hartsfield, your villain, who's a pretty villainous villain, driving his Mercedes through a crowd of job seekers who are lined up, poor people who are trying to get a job at a job fair. They've lined up and killing a whole bunch of them, crippling and injuring many more. A completely unmotivated act of random violence. And of course, all of us have this in mind these days in the light of just what happened in Orlando. And yes, the situations are different. Brady Hartsfield used a Mercedes, and the shooter in Orlando used a semi-automatic weapon and had allegedly motivations, political motivations, ISIS, hate crime motivations, hatred of gay and lesbian people. But it seems to me that there's a similarity there, this just desire to kill people, perfect strangers who have never hurt him or done anything to him, and all that. This is a really kind of dark side of the human psyche.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I got the idea originally, the kernel of the idea that became Mr. Mercedes came to me. I was driving up from Florida, and I make that drive by myself, and it's a place where I sort of recharge and listen to a lot of rock and roll and a lot of alt country stuff, and just kind of let my mind go in neutral, and it goes where it's going to go. And the first night after I left Florida, I stayed in South Carolina, and there was a story on the local news about a woman who had driven her car into a line of job seekers at McDonald's. Now, this was just after the economy cratered in 2008, and McDonald's had made a big deal, sort of a PR push about how they were going to help out America by hiring all these people at minimum wage, whatever it was at that time. And the story was that this woman had found out that her boyfriend was cheating on her with an outside woman, and that this outside woman was supposed to be at this job fair, and by God, she was going to take her out. Well, she didn't take her out, but she did take out a whole bunch of other people, and I thought, there's a seed here, there's something here in this act of almost random violence that I want to write about. And eventually, it became Mr. Mercedes, Finders Keepers, and End of Watch, and I was able to go back to the original crime, the job fair, with each one of those books, but to take it from a different perspective so that, you know, you're seeing it from 3 different angles, if you will. And the thing about Brady Hartsfield and what you're talking about, which is this whole kind of evil act on a grand scale, is that Brady only kills 8 people at the job fair, and he wounds a number of others, but he gets away with it. And his real plan is to get into a very large gathering, which happens to be a concert for a boy band, in a wheelchair loaded with plastic explosives, and kill himself and as many other people as he possibly can. And he has random thoughts of violence that come and go. He thinks about, well, maybe I could assassinate the president, and then he thinks, no, maybe I'll assassinate Brad Pitt, or maybe I'll assassinate Lady Gaga or Adele, and he wants to basically, he's a nobody, okay? And a lot of these guys are nobodies who see their way to some kind of stardom by creating an act of mass terror. And of course, the sad thing about this is that we remember the killers long after their victims are forgotten. And that's one of the things that makes this a self-perpetuating act. But I would argue that someone like the man who shot all these people in Orlando, he may have pledged allegiance to ISIS, but before that he was a spouse abuser and somebody with a lot of anger. And I think that in a lot of cases these acts are perpetrated by people who may put some political icing on the cake, but basically they're just fucking crazy. And and I want to say one other thing about that if that guy had gone in there with a knife, he would have been overpowered before he'd stabbed more than 4 people. And as long as you know, anybody who's got only 2 wheels on the road can walk into a store and buy a fucking killing machine, you know, like an AR-15 or something, this is just going to go on. I mean, it's really up to us.
Yeah. I mean, my fantasy series, of course, is often compared to Tolkien, and I've talked in many interviews about, and I love Tolkien. I'm the biggest fan in the world of Lord of the Rings. But
me too. Yeah.
Tolkien's view of good and evil in that is you know, evil is externalized. It comes from Sauron or Morgoth before it, and there are you know, orcs who are absolutely irredeemable, and you know, the good people get together and stop the orcs, and most of the good people are good. I've always been more attracted to gray characters, and I've said in many interviews, well, I do think the battle of good and evil is a great subject for fiction, but in my view, the battle for good and evil is waged within the individual human heart, and it's our decisions. We're all partly good and partly evil, and we make decisions every day, and we may do a good thing on Wednesday and then an evil thing on Thursday, or a selfish thing, and it's all very complicated, and that's kind of the approach that I've taken. But I'm also a huge fan of Lovecraft, and I think you are too, from reading some of your books, and I see Lovecraftian influences in things like the end of Revival, the vision of the afterlife there is a terrifying Lovecraftian moment. The short story, the name I'm forgetting, about the standing stones that everyone who sees them gets OCD. That's a very Lovecraftian story.
It's an easy title to forget. It's just N.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
And The Mist. The Mist is another incredible story. Very Lovecraftian. This mist escapes, and who knows what the hell is in there, but it's really scary in there.
It's going to be a TV series from Spike, too, and I think it might be interesting.
Wow. But, even though I see the Lovecraftian things, when I look at your books, the real villains are the people. I mean, Carrie kills a lot of people in that high school, but she's not the villain. The villain is the mother and the other kids who torment her and do that. Misery. Annie Wilkes is, what a horrifying creation, and one that both you and I live in constant terror of, and any successful writer.
Right.
And by the way, we were talking earlier in the green room there, and Steve asked if anyone ever showed up at my home, and people do occasionally show up at my home. But the creepiest thing that ever happened to me is one day there was a package in my mail, and I opened it, and it was just a paperback copy of Misery, with no letter, nothing, just some unknown fan.
It was from your number one fan.
I mean, Under the Dome, maybe you could say the aliens are the villains who've trapped it, but it's really the horrible, ordinary people under the dome who start doing these incredibly horrible things to each other. And Brady Hartsfield is a very clear and vivid example of that. Just a human being who's, The Mist is another one. I mean, there's the Lovecraftian monsters, but it's the crazy religious woman inside in the thing who really makes things 1,000 times worse. So, I don't know, what are your views on the nature of evil? Is there an external evil in the universe? Is it Sauron or Satan or Cthulhu? Or is it our own fucked up human natures?
It's interesting because you're right. There's no Sauron in the Thrones games. I mean, the evil weaves itself in and out the same way that the good weaves itself in and out of the characters. And one of the things about the thing is, I wrote a series of books called The Dark Tower, and those books were all done. Basically, the 7 Dark Tower books are one long novel that never got edited because they were done either as short stories or they were done as limited editions from Donald Grant Press. Nobody edited them and nobody copy edited them, so I went back and I revised the first one, and I really need to go back to all of them. And one of the things in there that to me is a problem is my version of Sauron was the Crimson King, and you see this mark, the eye of the king, all the time. That's outside evil, and in a way, outside evil is a more comforting concept than, the idea that the devil made me do it is a way of shucking responsibility and saying that I'm not there. So I think that we all understand that evil is inside a lot of people, and yet at the same time, I think that what a lot of, and I'm not expressing this very well, but what a lot of horror fiction does and what a lot of fantastic fiction does is it allows us to grapple with the outside evil that strikes us. You get a call on the phone that says, your cousin is dead because he was in that Orlando nightclub. Or you get a call like in the thing that makes End of Watch start. You get a diagnosis from the doctor that says you have cancer and you're probably going to die within the course of 16, 17 months because this thing's just gone too far, and it's the kind that's, in the book it's pancreatic cancer. And it's not a spoiler really because it's on page 9, for Christ's sake. So, So don't yell at me. I hate this thing about spoilers. Wow, 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 you spoiled this, you spoiled that. You can't spoil a book. Jesus Christ, it's a story. I mean, you go in there to have the experience. It isn't like, getting a G.I. Joe from the, in your cereal box or something. I told you I'm
Rosebud
not
is the sled.
I'm not expressing that very well. So there are two kinds of evil. There's inside evil and there's outside evil. And I think that when we have the stories like, N and the Lovecraftian stuff, we're trying to cope with the sort of things that happen in our lives that are bad things that we don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
George, we're going to have to wrap this up pretty soon. Is there anything that you've always wanted to ask me? Because, George, I will.
Yes, there is something I want to ask you.
All right.
How the fuck do you write so many books so fast? I think, I've had a really good 6 months. I've written 3 chapters, and you've finished 3 books in that time.
Here's the thing, okay? There are books and there are books. The way that I work, I try to get out there and I try to get 6 pages a day. So with a book like End of Watch, and when I'm working, I work every day, 3-4 hours, and I try to get those 6 pages and I try to get them fairly clean. So if the manuscript is, let's say, 360 pages long, that's basically 2 months' work. It's concentrated, but but that's assuming that it goes well.
And you do hit 6 pages a day?
I usually do.
You don't ever have a day where you sit down there and it's like constipation and you write a sentence and you hate the sentence and
Okay.
you check your email and you wonder if you had any talent after all and maybe you should have been a plumber. Don't you have days like that?
No, I mean, there's real life. I can be working away and something comes up and you have to basically get up and you have to go to see the doctor or you have to take somebody care package or you have to go to the post office because whatever. But mostly I try to get the 6 pages in, although entropy tries to intervene. I did an event at Radio City Music Hall for charity with John Irving and Joe Rowling, and this was the time, J.K. Rowling, and this was at the time that she was finishing the 7th Harry Potter books. And I know that I've been very fortunate as a writer, and you've been terrifically fortunate as a writer. You worked for a long time, wrote a lot of good books, won a lot of awards, and then out of nowhere, all of a sudden this crazy thing happens where all these books are suddenly New York Times bestsellers, and God knows it's deserved, but it's a sort of sudden thing. And here's the other thing, okay? People yell at you and say, we want the next book, we want the next book. They're like babies, we want the next book right away. I mean, it's a great thing to want that, but the pressure that you feel or I feel compared to that final Harry Potter book, everybody wanted that, and she came to New York and she was nearly finished with it and she'd agreed to do this event. And Joe was trying to do 3 things at once. She was going to do a vacation with her kids. She was going to finish the last 5 or 6 chapters of the 7th Harry Potter book, and she was going to do this event. And she showed up to do the sound check at Radio City Music Hall, and she was dressed like any housewife or mother or anyone who was on vacation. She had a shell top on and white clam digger pants and loafers or sandals or something, and her hair tied back in horsetails. And we were trying to talk about what we were going to do and everything. And the Scholastic Press publisher is pulling her aside and talking to her. And Joe was very polite. But when she came back and talked to me, she was really, really angry. And what she said was, they don't understand what we do they? And I said, how can they understand when we don't understand?
All too true.
Yeah.
But I do understand that our hour is up, sadly. We could go on for 8 more hours here, so
We
I
could,
hope you
really.
come back to the land
You
of
guys have
enchantment
been
someday.
great, and George has been great, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Read more books.